The snow had been falling since before dawn. By the time the bailiff called the room to order, it lay 3 inches thick on the courthouse steps, muffling the sound of the town of Harwick, Minnesota, as it went about its morning business trucks, warming in driveways, a diner somewhere turning on its neon sign, the salt truck grinding down Elm Street, with its amber lights going round and round. Inside the courtroom, the radiators hissed and ticked. The windows along the east wall were fogged at the corners. The ceiling lights gave everything a flat, gray quality, the kind of light that makes people look older than they are. Ethan Cole looked very old. He sat at the defendant's table in a gray shirt that didn't fit him, the collar loose around a neck that had grown lean over years of outdoor work and nights spent in cold that settled into a person's joints and didn't leave. His wrists rested in his lap, handcuffed. His hair had gone white sometime in the last decade. Though nobody in this courtroom had watched it happen, his eyes, pale blue, deep set under thick brows, were fixed on a point on the table in front of him, as if there were something written there that only he could read. He had no lawyer. That had been the subject of considerable legal negotiation for the better part of a month. Ethan had been offered a public defender named Gerald Moss, a man with a briefcase held together by electrical tape and the resigned expression of someone who had been doing this job 30 years too long. Ethan had accepted the appointment, sat through 2 meetings, and then, 4 days before trial, Gerald Moss had filed a motion to withdraw, citing irreconcilable differences with his client's refusal to enter a plea deal. The motion was granted. There was no time to appoint someone new, so Ethan Cole sat at the defendant's table alone. The charge was second-degree murder in the death of Dale Whitmore, 58, plant manager at Harwick Timber Processing. Whitmore's body had been found in the parking lot of the plant on the morning of November 3rd. Ethan had been present. There had been an argument the evening before, witnessed by 2 employees. There was no physical evidence connecting Ethan to the death, no weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints, but the prosecutor, a compact man named Christopher Farrell, who wore a pale blue tie and checked his watch more than was strictly necessary, had told the jury in his opening statement that he intended to show them a man with motive, opportunity, and a history of confrontation with the victim. The gallery was full. Harwick was not a large town. Nobody was sitting at the defense table. Then, the courtroom doors opened. They came in together. Which was the first strange thing. 2 people. Moving with the particular kind of certainty that belongs to people who have already decided what they're going to do. The man was young, mid-20s perhaps, in a charcoal suit that fit him properly, a leather briefcase under his arm, his face composed. The woman was perhaps a year younger, in a dark blazer, carrying a canvas bag that sagged with the weight of file folders and a recorder. Both of them were black. Both of them walked directly to the defense table as if they had been assigned those seats years ago, as if there were no other place in the room they would ever think to sit. The man set his briefcase on the table, placed his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, and said something too quiet for the gallery to hear. Ethan looked up. Something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly, but something like the expression of a man who has been bracing for a blow and instead receives a hand. The gallery began to murmur. Judge Sandra Holbrook, gray-haired, wire-framed glasses, a face built for patience, gavelled for order, and looked at the defense table. Counsel, identify yourself for the record. The young man stood. Marcus Reed, Your Honor. Admitted to the Minnesota Bar, license number 4421867. I'm appearing as defense counsel for Mr. Ethan Cole. And the young woman with you? Naomi Reed. She's a credentialed investigative journalist, Your Honor. She has standing to observe proceedings, and I'll be calling upon her research during the course of the defense. Same surname. Yes, Your Honor. A brief pause. He's our father. The murmur in the gallery rose sharply. Judge Holbrook's gavel came down again, harder this time. Christopher Farrell, at the prosecutor's table, had stopped checking his watch. He was staring at Marcus Reed with an expression of genuine uncertainty, the expression of a man who had prepared for one kind of fight and found himself standing in front of another. Nobody in the gallery spoke for a moment. Then a woman in the 3rd row leaned toward the man beside her and said, just loudly enough to carry. Whose children are those? The man beside her didn't answer. To understand that, you would have to go back 21 years. You would have to go back to a night cold enough to kill a night that began, as so many defining nights do, at the door of a grocery store, with two small children standing in the snow. The winter of 2003 came early to Harwick County. By the second week of November, the temperatures had dropped below zero and showed no interest in climbing back up. The birch trees along Route 9 stood stripped and white. The Crow River had frozen at the edges and was working its way toward the center. Farmers who had lived there 40 years said it was the kind of cold that meant business. The kind that found the gaps in your house and made itself comfortable. Ethan Cole was living in his truck. It was a 1994 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked perhaps 80% of the time. He kept sleeping bags in the cab and a camp stove in the bed, and a routine that involved moving the truck every 2 or 3 days, so that no one officer of the law was in a position to notice he was there consistently. He knew the parking lots that didn't get patrolled after 9. He knew which gas stations had bathrooms with locks. He knew that the library on Fenton Street opened at 8 in the morning, and the staff left him alone as long as he was quiet, which he always was. He had been this way for 8 months. Before that, a rented house on the east side of town, a marriage, a job at the county road maintenance depot. His wife, Caroline, had died of ovarian cancer in February. Diagnosed in September and gone by February, which was the kind of timeline that didn't leave room for adjustment. She had been 37 years old. They had not had children, which Ethan had thought was a source of sadness during their marriage, and found was simply a different kind of sadness after she was gone. He had kept his job for 2 months after the funeral, then stopped going in. Not because he couldn't work, but because the work was the same as it had been and everything else was different, and that asymmetry had been unbearable in a way he could not explain to the depot supervisor who finally let him go. He had been sober for 11 years at the time Caroline died. He remained sober after. That was the one thing that held. He was parked behind the Harwick family foods on County Road 8 when he heard them. He wasn't sure at first what he was hearing. The wind had been making strange sounds all night, and sounds carried differently in serious cold, arriving with a clarity that tricked the ear. But this was not wind. This was a child crying. Then, after a moment, 2 children. He sat in the cab for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he put on his coat and got out. They were on the front steps, around the corner from the parking lot. 2 children. A boy of about 7, wearing a thin jacket that was built for a Minnesota fall rather than a Minnesota winter, and a girl of about 5, tucked under his arm, her face pressed into his side. The boy had his chin up and his jaw set in the manner of someone who has decided that looking capable is the only thing standing between himself and disaster. The girl was past the stage of crying and into the stage of shuddering. Ethan stopped at a distance. "Hey," he said. The boy looked at him. Dark eyes, measuring, not afraid or refusing to be afraid, which was not the same thing. "You kids waiting for someone?" The boy didn't answer immediately. He was assessing. Ethan recognized the calculation happening behind those eyes because he had seen it in adults who had learned not to trust quickly. "Our mom's inside," the boy said. Ethan looked at the door. The store had been closed for 90 minutes. The lights through the window were the overnight security lights, not the shopping lights. He didn't call attention to the discrepancy. "How long have you been out here?" The boy's jaw tightened. "A while." Ethan looked at the girl. Her lips had taken on a color that concerned him. "I'm going to get you something warm," he said. "I'm not going to touch you, and I'm not going to make you go anywhere. I'm just going to be right back." He went to the truck. There was a thermos he'd filled at the gas station that morning, coffee, gone cold hours ago. But the truck's heater had kept the cab warm, and the thermos was still faintly warm to the touch. He also found, in the bag behind the passenger seat, 2 packets of instant hot chocolate he had bought for himself and not yet used. He heated water on the camp stove, mixed the packets, and came back around the corner. The boy was still there, still holding his sister, still standing exactly as he had been. He had not moved an inch. Ethan crouched down, so he was at eye level. Hot chocolate. The girl raised her head and looked at it. She looked at Ethan. She looked at the cup. "He gave us something warm," she said. It was the third person, as if she were reporting to someone. As if she wanted it on record. Ethan called the police from the parking lot. He told the dispatcher there were 2 children outside the grocery store who appeared to have been there for some time. He stayed until the squad car arrived, standing near but not too near, letting the children see he wasn't leaving. The officer, who came out a young deputy named Foster, looked at Ethan with the kind of professional suspicion that was not entirely unfair given the circumstances. A white man in a parking lot at 11 at night with 2 black children he claimed to have found. Ethan answered every question directly, did not argue, and gave his license when asked. He watched them get into the warm squad car. He drove back to his spot behind the grocery store and did not sleep for a very long time. The children's names, he learned afterward, were Marcus and Naomi Wiley. Their mother, a woman named Darlene Wiley, had died 3 weeks earlier of a drug overdose in a motel room on the edge of town. She had been 26 years old. The children had been placed in emergency foster care, moved once, and were then in a temporary placement with a couple who had agreed to take 1 child and found themselves, through bureaucratic sequence and the stubbornness of the boy, with 2. The boy, Marcus, had refused to be separated from his sister. This was documented in the case file in language that managed to be both clinical and faintly admiring. Child exhibits strong protective behavior toward younger sibling. Reunification efforts complicated by subject's refusal to enter any placement that does not include sibling. Ethan found all of this out in the waiting room of the Harwick County Department of Children and Family Services, which was where he went one morning in January with a cup of bad coffee and an idea he had not yet decided whether to pursue. He sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before a caseworker named Patricia Delray came to speak with him. She was a practical woman in her late 40s, not unkind, but with the practiced guardedness of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have learned that people who came in with good intentions were not automatically people who could follow through on them. She listened to what Ethan had to say. She looked at his file, the address, which was currently a P.O. box, the employment history, the financial standing. She said, as gently as she could, "Mr. Cole, fostering is a serious commitment. There are requirements around housing, income, background checks." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not saying I meet them right now. I'm asking what it would take." That conversation took 20 minutes. Ethan left with a list. What followed was 6 months that he did not often speak about afterward, not because they were shameful, but because they were the kind of work that loses something in the description: the rented room in the boarding house on 2nd Street, the job at the lumber yard that paid enough to qualify, the background check that came back clean, the parenting classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings after a full day on his feet, the home study visit where Patricia Delray walked through the rented room with a clipboard and said almost nothing and wrote things down. There were people who said things to him during those 6 months. A woman from his church told him he was asking for trouble. A man at the lumber yard said he admired what he was trying to do, but had he thought it through. A neighbor in the boarding house, who had lived in Harwick her whole life and considered herself a good judge of these things, told him that a white man raising 2 black children in this town was setting up all 3 of them for heartbreak. Ethan listened to all of it. "I don't have much," he had said to Patricia Delray. On the day the approval came through. "But I won't let them be alone." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had stamped the form. He picked them up on a Thursday afternoon in June, which seemed right summer just beginning. The days long, the air warm enough for windows down on the drive back to the boarding house, which he had now moved out of for a rented house on Maple Street that was small but had 2 bedrooms and a yard with a tree in it. Marcus sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window the whole way. Naomi sat in the back and clutched a stuffed rabbit that was missing one eye and had been washed so many times the fur had gone soft and flat. She did not say anything for most of the drive. Then, as they turned onto Maple Street, she said, "Is there a bathtub?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Okay," she said. This appeared to settle something for her. The house was clean. He had cleaned it 4 times in the preceding week, which was 2 times more than was necessary, but he had not been able to stop himself. There were 2 beds in the smaller bedroom purchased second-hand, with new mattresses and a reading lamp on a nightstand between them. There was food in the refrigerator, including a box of the same hot chocolate packets. He had thought about whether to put them out or not. He had put them out. Naomi found the hot chocolate immediately, as if she had been looking for it. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the room with the expression of someone conducting a thorough inventory. After a while, Ethan turned off the light and left the door open. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to the house settle around him. After perhaps 20 minutes, the small footsteps came down the hallway, and Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment. "Are you going to leave too?" The question was asked in a flat, factual tone, the tone of someone who has collected data on how things go, and is simply asking for confirmation of the next data point. Ethan did not answer right away. He thought about the various reassurances available to him, the things a person was supposed to say. He thought about how many people had probably said those things to this boy already, and how each one of those people had eventually not been there. He pulled out the chair across from him. Marcus came to the table and sat down. They didn't talk. Ethan made 2 cups of hot chocolate, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, while the summer night settled around the small house, and the tree in the yard moved in the breeze, and the streetlight outside the window cast a long orange square across the kitchen floor. After a while, Marcus put his head down on his folded arms. He was asleep in minutes. Ethan sat there. When Marcus woke in the morning, stiff from having slept at the kitchen table, Ethan was still in the same chair. He had not moved. What they had was not easy. It was important to say that plainly, because there was a version of this story that wanted to make it simple, the good man and the children he saved, all obstacles melting away before the warmth of intention. That version was comfortable, and it was false. What they had was a life with actual texture. The arguments about homework, the years when money was short enough that Christmas required real creativity, the school meetings where Ethan sat across from teachers who directed their questions about the children to the social worker rather than to him, the cashier at the hardware store who said, loudly enough to be heard, that it was interesting when Marcus called him Dad, the neighbor children who asked Marcus and Naomi, with the unembarrassed cruelty available only to children, why their father was white. There were things Ethan had not been prepared for, not because he hadn't tried, but because some things can only be learned from the inside. He had not fully understood, for instance, what it would mean for 2 black children to grow up in a town like Harwick, with a white man as their only parent. Not the daily mechanics of it, the looks, the comments, the way certain spaces contracted around them in ways that were hard to name precisely but impossible to miss. He had not understood it the way they understood it, because he could not, and he knew that, and it was something he turned over in his mind regularly, in the early years, with the particular discomfort of a man who genuinely wants to do something that is not entirely within his power to do. What he could do was make sure they knew the difference between the smallness of other people and the size of themselves. He took Marcus to the public library on Saturdays, starting when Marcus was 9, and they went through the history section together, not in a didactic way, not as a lesson, but as a shared project, both of them reading and asking questions and following the threads that interested them. Marcus had developed, around 11, a deep and almost scholarly interest in civil rights law, which surprised Ethan not because it seemed incongruous, but because it seemed so entirely predictable in retrospect. This boy who had been standing in the cold refusing to be separated from his sister, who had been calculating odds and trusting only what he could verify since before he had language for it, of course. He would become a person who wanted to understand the mechanics of justice. Of course, he would want to know who made the rules and how. Naomi's path was less linear and more instinctive. She had been writing things down since she could hold a pencil. She wrote about the kids at school and the woman at the church who looked at their family funny and the way the light came through the kitchen window on winter mornings and what it felt like to run fast. She wrote about things that had happened to her and things she had observed happening to other people, and gradually, without quite deciding to, she became a person who noticed everything and forgot nothing. By the time she was in high school and had an English teacher who told her she should think about journalism, she had already been doing it for years without the name. Ethan came to Marcus's law school graduation in Minneapolis on a June day so hot the asphalt was soft underfoot. He wore a suit he had bought for the occasion, navy blue, slightly too warm for the weather, and sat in the auditorium with several hundred other families and watched his son cross the stage. When Marcus shook the dean's hand and turned to hold his diploma up toward where Ethan was sitting fourth row, slightly to the left, where Marcus had told him to sit, Ethan pressed his hand flat over his chest without meaning to, like checking that something was still there. Later, at dinner, Marcus had given a toast that mentioned Ethan by name and said a few things that Ethan could not entirely recall afterward because his hearing had gone slightly strange, the way sounds sometimes do when you're holding back something large. He had cleared his throat and raised his glass. "To the law," he said, because he could not find the other words at that particular moment. And Marcus had laughed, had known exactly what he meant, as he always did. Marcus had developed, by the time he was 12, a manner of stillness in the face of provocation, a particular quality of deliberate calm that was different from not caring. It was the stillness of someone who had decided not to give certain people the satisfaction. He had gotten it, Ethan thought, from watching. From years of watching a man navigate a town that found him strange and persist anyway, quietly, without making it anyone else's problem. Naomi was different. Naomi felt everything at full volume and then thought about it afterward. She cried when she was angry and laughed when she was sad, and had, from the age of about 8, been writing things down in a series of composition notebooks that she kept stacked under her bed. By 14, she had decided she was going to be a journalist. Ethan had no memory of having helped her decide this. It seemed to be something she had decided herself, the same way she had decided everything important with the absolute conviction of someone who has been uncertain about enough things to recognize certainty when it shows up. There was one bad winter when Naomi was 15. She had gotten into a group at school. A group that required, for membership, a particular kind of detachment from the things that made you different. She had cut her hair. She had started using a different name. She had come home one afternoon with a group of these new friends, and when one of them, a girl named Brittany, who wore too much perfume and spoke in a constant low-grade condescension, asked about Ethan, who was coming up the porch steps with grocery bags, Naomi had said, looking at the ground, "He's just like the guy who takes care of us." Marcus heard it from the upstairs window. He didn't come downstairs. Ethan had heard it too. He went inside, set the grocery bags on the counter, and then went back out through the back door and sat on the steps in the cold for a long time. Long enough that the sky went dark and the temperature dropped 10 degrees, and he was shivering slightly when he came back in. He didn't say anything about it that night. Or the next day. 2 days later, Naomi came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning early, before Marcus was up and stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said. He poured her a cup of coffee, which she had recently started drinking, and set it on the table. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Her eyes were red. She had probably not slept. "Fear is not your enemy," he said, after a moment. "Letting it choose for you is." She looked at the cup. "I wasn't afraid," she said. "I was." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't want them to think." "I know what you didn't want them to think," he said. A long silence. "Does it matter?" she asked. "What they think?" He thought about this seriously. Which was the thing about him, he thought about things seriously. As if every question deserved the full weight of his attention. "It matters what you think," he said. "That's the only part you're in charge of." She cried then. Not quietly, but not dramatically, just the way she cried. The way she felt things, all of it at once. He let her. After a while, she stopped and drank her coffee, and they sat together in the morning kitchen, the light coming in through the east-facing window at a low, winter angle, and outside the tree in the yard was bare, and the snow was new. She never did it again. Years had a way of accumulating without announcement. Marcus won a scholarship to the University of Minnesota, then to law school. Naomi went to Northwestern on a journalism fellowship, and from there to a position at the Minneapolis Tribune's investigative desk. They came home for holidays and brought their lives with them in the way children do when they've grown up, and made something of themselves, the particular warmth of adults returning to the place that made them. Ethan still lived in the house on Maple Street. He had eventually bought it from the landlord not because it was a good investment but because it was home, because he knew every creak in the floorboards and every draft in the window frames, and had fixed most of them over 15 years with his own hands. He still worked with his hands. He had been at the lumber yard for years, then at the county road depot, then doing private contracting, small repairs, seasonal maintenance, the invisible labor that keeps a town intact. He was known for the quality of his work and for not talking much, which was considered, in Harwick, to be a reasonable combination of virtues. He had not remarried. He had come close, once, with a woman named Helen, who taught 5th grade at the elementary school and laughed easily and made good soup and understood, mostly, what his life was. They had ended it mutually and remained friendly in the way of people who've respected each other enough not to pretend. He did not think of himself as a man who had made sacrifices. He had never, not once, framed it that way in his own mind. The children had cost him things, and the children had given him things, and on the balance, he had come out somewhere so far ahead of where he would have been that the math seemed almost embarrassing to calculate. He kept, in his wallet, a Christmas card that Naomi had made him when she was 8 years old. On the front, in purple and green crayon, were 3 figures holding hands. A tall one with yellow hair, a medium one with dark hair and a serious expression, and a small one with a large smile and a rabbit under her arm. Above the figures, in careful block letters, "Our Family." The card was creased and worn at the folds. The crayon had faded. He had transferred it from wallet to wallet for 16 years. Dale Whitmore had been the plant manager at Harwick Timber Processing for 9 years. He was not a popular man, particularly among the workers he supervised, for reasons that were varied and well documented, if you knew where to look. A pattern of favoring certain workers over others, along lines that had more to do with who you drank with than how you worked. A tendency to falsify maintenance records, to keep production targets on schedule, and this was the part that connected to Ethan, a habit of finding pretexts to discharge workers who had been there long enough to qualify for pension protections. Ethan had been employed at the timber plant for 2 years when the conflict began. He had taken the job at 51 because the county road work had dried up, and private contracting had a way of slowing in the winter. And the timber plant offered steady hours and benefits. He did not love the work. It was loud and repetitive, and the culture of the floor was built on a kind of competitive grievance that he found wearying, but he was good at it, which was the thing he had always been, good at the work in front of him, regardless of whether the work was interesting. His supervisor on the floor was a reasonable man named Jim Kowalski, who told him in his first month that he was the most reliable hire he'd had in 3 years, which Ethan accepted without comment. The trouble with Whitmore began over a maintenance dispute. One of the saw machines on line 3 had been throwing errors, a vibration issue that Ethan had flagged in writing twice. Whitmore's response had been to note the flag and continue running the machine. Ethan had escalated to the regional safety line, which was the correct procedure, and which had resulted in nothing except Whitmore becoming aware that Ethan had gone around him. It had started there and proceeded, as these things do, through stages. It had started there and proceeded, as these things do, through stages that accumulated until the argument in the parking lot on November 2nd, an argument that was, by all accounts, about a termination notice that Whitmore had put in Ethan's file that afternoon, citing performance reasons that did not correspond to any documented evaluation. Ethan had returned to the lot after hours because he had left his thermos in the break room and had encountered Whitmore crossing to his car. The argument that followed lasted perhaps 8 minutes and ended with both men walking away. The next morning, Dale Whitmore was dead. Ethan was arrested 4 days later. The case against him was examined closely. A structure built on air. 2 witnesses who had seen an argument, proximity to the scene, and a motive that any of a dozen workers at the plant could have claimed. There was no weapon. There was no physical evidence. The medical examiner's report was, in critical places, ambiguous, but Harwick was a small town, and Ethan Cole was a man without connections, and the prosecutor's office was facing a death that required an answer. Gerald Moss, the public defender, had come to Ethan in jail with the deal the prosecutor was offering. Plead guilty to a reduced charge, recommend leniency, serve perhaps 8 years with good behavior. Ethan had listened to the full presentation. "I didn't do it," he said. That's not the question, Gerald Moss had said, not unkindly. The question is what you can prove. Then the answer is the same, Ethan said. I didn't raise my children to lie. I'm not going to start now. Gerald Moss had closed his briefcase and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Mr. Cole, he said, your children aren't here. They will be, Ethan said. Marcus Reed had been in the middle of a deposition in Minneapolis when Naomi's text came through. He read it twice. Then he stepped out of the conference room, called her back, and listened for 11 minutes without saying a word. When she was done, he said, send me everything. He was in Harwick before the end of the day. The prosecutor's office, when notified that Ethan Cole had retained counsel, had reacted with the professional confidence of an office that believed its case was solid. Christopher Farrell had been practicing for 16 years. He had tried 43 cases. He was good at what he did. What he had not accounted for was Naomi. While Marcus worked the legal architecture of the defense, the motion to compel disclosure of the full maintenance records at the timber plant, the subpoenas for the personnel files of the two witnesses, the careful preparation of Ethan's timeline, Naomi had been doing what she did, which was finding the thing that was buried. She found it in the financial records. Dale Whitmore, it turned out, had not been acting alone in the falsification of maintenance records. He had been working within a system that benefited from those falsifications, a system that included 2 senior managers at the regional company that owned Harwick Timber Processing, managers who had approved production bonuses tied to targets that could only be met if certain safety inspections were quietly skipped. Whitmore had not been the origin of the corruption. He had been a participant, and in the weeks before his death, according to emails Naomi obtained through a source who had retained a copy, he had been threatening to go to the state labor board unless his cut was increased. The 2 workers who had witnessed the argument between Ethan and Whitmore, a man named Roger Hatch and a man named Devin Clark, had both received bonuses in the weeks before they gave their statements to police. Marcus presented the maintenance records on the 3rd day of trial. Farrell objected on grounds of relevance. Judge Holbrook allowed them. Marcus presented the bonus payments on the 4th day. Farrell objected on grounds of prejudice. Judge Holbrook took it under advisement, excused the jury, and held a 40-minute discussion in chambers that Naomi, sitting in the gallery, watched through the glass door with the expression of someone waiting for a blood test result. The judge allowed the payments into evidence. On the 5th day, Marcus put Roger Hatch on the stand. Roger Hatch was a man of about 50, built like a wood stove, with the careful blankness of someone who has rehearsed his answers. He told the story he had been telling since November. The argument, Ethan's raised voice, Whitmore backing away, Ethan's truck leaving the lot. Marcus cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He began with the small things, the specific location of where Hatch had been standing, the direction of the parking lot lights, the model and color of the vehicles in the lot that night. He let Hatch commit to each detail with increasing specificity, building a 3-dimensional picture. Then, he presented an engineering analysis of the parking lot's lighting system. The distance from where Hatch claimed to have been standing to where Ethan's truck was parked, given the placement of the light poles and their documented wattage, would have made it effectively impossible to identify someone's facial expression or the specific physical gestures of an argument with any confidence. Hatch stared at the diagram. You could see them arguing? Marcus asked. Yes. You could see their faces clearly? A pause. I could see there was movement, Mr. Hatch. The light pole nearest to the location you've described was out of service on the night in question. There's a maintenance request here, filed November 1st. Could you see their faces? The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. On the 6th day of trial, Marcus Reed gave his closing argument. He began with the evidence, as he was supposed to. He went through it methodically, the absence of physical evidence, the compromised credibility of the witnesses, the financial transactions that provided an alternative theory of motive, the ambiguities in the medical examiner's report. He was precise and clear, and gave the jury nothing to find fault with, as far as the law was concerned. And then he did something that was not quite in the playbook. He turned away from the jury for a moment. He looked at the man sitting at the defense table, the old man in the ill-fitting shirt. The man who had sat through 6 days of trial with the same stillness he brought to everything, who had not visibly reacted to any of it, who had looked, through the whole proceeding, less like a man on trial for his life, and more like a man waiting for a bus. Marcus turned back to the jury. "I want to tell you something about the man you've been looking at this week," he said. Not as his attorney. As his son. Farrell rose. "Your Honor, it's closing argument, Mr. Farrell," Judge Holbrook said. "Sit down." "In 2003, Marcus said, "I was 7 years old. My sister was 5. It was November. The temperature that night was 14 degrees, which is cold enough to be dangerous for a child without adequate clothing, which we did not have. We had been waiting outside a closed store for several hours. I don't know, now, exactly how long. Long enough for my sister to stop crying and start shivering. Which is worse. The courtroom was absolutely still. A man came around the corner. He was white. He was middle-aged. He was, we would learn, living out of his truck. He had no particular reason to stop, no obligation, no benefit, nothing to gain. He could see that we were not the same color as him, which in certain contexts and certain towns is a reason to keep walking, not a reason to stop. He paused. He stopped. The radiators hissed. He made us hot chocolate in a parking lot at 11 o'clock at night. He called the police. He waited until help came, and then he watched us leave. And then, and this is the part that I think about, he went home and decided he wasn't done. Farrell was very still at his table. It took him 6 months to qualify as a foster parent. He worked a full-time job and took parenting classes at night. He rented a house. He bought 2 beds. The process asked him to demonstrate, through documentation and home studies and background checks, that he was a suitable person to take care of children. He did every single thing that was asked of him. Marcus moved closer to the jury box. He raised us in this town. Some of you are old enough to remember. He drove us to school every day in a truck that sometimes started on the second try. He sat in parent-teacher conferences and absorbed the particular discomfort of teachers who weren't sure how to talk to him about his children. He worked extra shifts so we could go to summer camp and take the SAT prep course. He made dinner every night. He was there every morning. He glanced once at Ethan. He is not an eloquent man. He is not a powerful man. He has no connections in this town, no political capital, no one to speak for him. The prosecutor's office, I suspect, chose him partly for these reasons. A man without resources is a man who can be made to fit a story. His voice was level, entirely level. What the prosecutor's office did not know, and what I believe this jury now knows, is that this man, this quiet, unconnected, unremarkable man spent 21 years making 2 people who would not be what we are without him. He made us because he refused to walk past 2 cold children in a parking lot. He made us because he kept every single promise he made, including the ones he made without words, and he made us capable of standing in this room and telling you the truth. He let that sit for a moment. The truth is, there is no credible evidence that Ethan Cole killed Dale Whitmore. There is credible evidence that Dale Whitmore was involved in a pattern of corruption that gave several other people motive to want him dead, and that the primary witnesses against Mr. Cole received financial benefits from the people at the center of that corruption shortly before providing their statements. He returned to the defense table. "That's the legal case," he said. "The rest of it, the 21 years, I just wanted you to know. I wanted you to know who you're looking at." He sat down. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Naomi spent those 2 days doing the thing she had always done with waiting, which was to work. She filed 2 additional pieces with her editor follow-up reporting on the maintenance records and on the bonus payments, and spent an afternoon on the phone with the State Labor Board, which had, upon receiving her initial reporting, opened a formal inquiry into Harwick Timber Processing. The senior managers named in the emails had, by the end of the 2nd day, lawyered up. On the morning of the 3rd day, the jury returned. Not guilty. The words landed in the courtroom the way verdicts always do, as both a surprise and an inevitability, as if the result had been determined long before it was announced. and the deliberation was simply the time required to make it official. Ethan received the news with the same stillness he brought to everything. The bailiff removed the handcuffs. Ethan sat for a moment, looking at his wrists, looking at them the way a person looks at something ordinary that has briefly, through contrast, become visible again. Then Marcus put a hand on his arm and he stood. Naomi was there, in front of him, and she was holding something, the Christmas card from when she was 8, creased and faded, which she had taken from his wallet sometime during the trial without telling him. She held it out to him. He looked at it for a long time. "You kept it," she said. "Of course I kept it," he said. The gallery was clearing out behind them. Farrell was at his table, talking quietly to a paralegal, his pale blue tie slightly askew. Judge Holbrook had already left the bench. The radiators were still hissing. Ethan took the card and put it back where it belonged. Outside, the snow was still falling. It fell on the courthouse steps, and on the salt-streaked sidewalk, and on the rooftops of Harwick, Minnesota, on the diner's neon sign, and the library where Ethan had once spent his mornings, and the lumberyard where he had worked his way back to being able to provide. It fell on the tree in the yard on Maple Street, and on the 2 beds in the small bedroom that nobody slept in anymore but that were still there, made up with clean sheets because Ethan made them up every time he changed the linens and had never stopped. The 3 of them stood on the steps, not performing anything, not posing, just standing together in the cold the way people stand when the thing they have been bracing for has finally passed, and there is nothing to do yet except breathe. Somewhere behind them, a woman in a good coat, one of the gallery observers, stopped on her way to her car and looked at them. She had been in the 3rd row on the first day. The one who had leaned over and asked whose children they were. She looked at them for a moment. The old man with the white hair, the young man in the charcoal suit, the young woman with the canvas bag still heavy with documents. Then she kept walking. The snow came down. The 3 of them stood in it. Marcus said something to Ethan, too quiet to hear. Ethan shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in the way of someone setting something down, some long-carried weight whose exact name he had never quite found. Naomi put her arm through his and looked up at the gray Minnesota sky with the expression of a person taking inventory of something enormous and finding it, against all reasonable expectation, intact. They did not go to dinner that night. They went home, to the house on Maple Street, to the kitchen where so many mornings had happened, where the light came in low through the east-facing window in winter and fell across the table at the same angle it always had. Ethan made coffee, and Naomi sat in the chair she had always sat in, the one nearest the window, and Marcus stood at the counter, the way he always had when he was thinking something through, as if he needed the solid surface behind him. They didn't talk much. There had been so many words in the last 6 days that the quiet felt like something to walk around in, to appreciate the way you appreciate silence after a storm. After a while, Naomi pulled out her composition notebook. She still kept them. Still wrote by hand. Still had the specific brand with the black and white marbled cover, and wrote something. Ethan looked at the table. Marcus looked out the window at the snow falling on the yard. The tree out there was bare, its branches collecting snow the way they always did in November, bending slightly under the weight of it and then releasing it in small cascades when the wind shifted. Ethan had planted that tree 7 years ago when the original one had come down in a storm. He had planted it with Marcus home for the weekend, both of them digging in the hard autumn ground, the boy who was now a lawyer handing him dirt-crusted rocks from the hole and explaining, at 17, his theory of why certain contract laws were structurally unjust. Ethan had listened and dug and said, occasionally, "You may be right about that." He watched the snow fall on the tree he had planted and thought that this was the thing nobody told you, that the years did not feel like accumulation while you were living them. They felt like today, always today, the coffee getting cold and the light changing, and the people you loved sitting across from you in a kitchen that smelled like home. It was only afterward, looking back, that the shape became visible. Only from a distance that you could see what had been built. He picked up his cup. After a while, the 3 of them sat at the table together, and the snow came down outside, and the kitchen was warm.